pattern set for Christ's substitution. This time we will look at the deliverance from Egypt as a pattern for our deliverance from bondage and how Jesus would accomplish that. In Genesis chapter 15, God confirmed his promise to Abraham and made a covenant with him. In verses 13 and 14, God informed Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved to another country for 400 years. Then God would judge that nation and bring them out of bondage with great substance. In Genesis, we learn that Abraham's son Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. The promise was passed on through Jacob, whose name was changed by God to Israel. This name change meant that Jacob had power with God as a prince. Israel had 12 sons, the second youngest of whom was Joseph. Joseph had a couple of dreams that he shared with his brothers. In these dreams, it showed his brothers bowing down to him. These dreams angered his brothers so much that they wanted to murder him. But instead, they took opportunity to sell him to some Ishmaelite merchants who were going into Egypt. The Ishmaelites, in turn, sold him to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officers and captain of the guard. Potiphar so thoroughly trusted Joseph and honored him that he gave him rule over everything in his house. The only thing he accepted from and not give him rule over was his wife. But Potiphar's wife became so enamored with Joseph and so desirous to have him that she tried to seduce him. When this failed, she accused him of trying to rape her and grabbed one of his garments and took it and showed it to Potiphar and said that he tried to rape her. When Potiphar heard this, he put Joseph in the inner prison, in the inside prison, the depths of the prison, the worst part of the prison. He put him in there to be punished in punishment for his supposed attempt to rape Potiphar's wife. While he was in prison, the prisoners was so trusting of Joseph and saw so much quality in Joseph that he put Joseph in charge of all of the prisoners and he gave them the care of them. And he didn't worry about anything the prisoners did because Joseph was taking care of it and Joseph was very trustworthy. While Joseph was in prison, Pharaoh's baker and his butler both had dreams. In their dreams, they didn't know what they meant, so they brought him to Joseph because they thought Joseph was wise. Maybe he could help them out. The baker had dreamed that he had 3 cakes on his head, and the birds came and ate the cakes from his head. And the butler had a dream about giving the wine to Pharaoh. And Joseph interpreted the dreams, and he said, in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to hang the baker, but the butler will be restored to his office as the chief butler for Pharaoh. This was about 2 years after. This was while he was in prison. And so it happened on Pharaoh's birthday 3 days later, just like Joseph said it would. Then about 2 years after this, Pharaoh had 2 dreams that worried him. In the first, he saw 7 fat and healthy cows, then 7 malnourished cows. The 7 thin cows devoured the 7 fat cows and were still as thin as before. In the second dream, he saw 7 ears of corn that were big, full, and healthy. Then 7 thin, wind-blasted ears of corn came up and devoured the 7 good corns, but they were still blasted and thin. And Pharaoh consulted all of his magicians and all of his wise men and all of his people he thought might be able to tell him what the dream was, and no one could tell him. Then Pharaoh's chief butler finally remembered how Joseph had interpreted his and the baker's dreams when they were in prison. He told Pharaoh how Joseph had interpreted them, and it happened just the way Joseph had told them it would. Upon hearing this, Pharaoh brought him out of the prison, and Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams because he heard that Joseph could interpret dreams. So Joseph told Pharaoh that the interpretation belonged to God, and God would give him the interpretation. Then he said the 2 dreams were one, but were given in 2 dreams because the matter was settled and could not be changed. The dream meant there would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of extreme famine, so severe that the 7 plenteous years would be forgotten. He suggested that Pharaoh seek out a wise man with discretion who could store up the grain and food from the good years to make provision for the years of famine. Upon hearing this, made Pharaoh made Joseph rule over all of Egypt, and Joseph's wise rule over Egypt brought them through the famine with great success and prosperity. When Joseph's family, the nation of Israel, came to Egypt, Pharaoh gave them Goshen for their home because they were shepherds. Joseph ruled Egypt for about 70 years and he died at the age of 110 years. While in Egypt, the Israelites multiplied and became a strong nation of their own. Then there arose a Pharaoh who did not know the history of the Israelites and how Joseph had caused Egypt to prosper. He was afraid of the Israelites that they would join up with their enemy in the event of war and overthrow Egypt. So he chose to enslave the Israelites in order to diminish them and keep them under Egypt's control. The Israelites continued to multiply and became stronger. Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill all the males born to the Israelites. The midwives refused to do so, so Pharaoh ordered that all the male children born to the Israelites would be thrown into the river to die. Pharaoh was so terrified of the Israelite men who were strong and continuing to multiply. They were in bondage to Egypt for some 400 years and built the cities of Pithom and Ramses. Pharaoh was extremely terrified that the Israelites would multiply and would join up and overthrow Egypt, and they would be Egypt's demise. Pharaoh was scared to death of them, and so he kept them enslaved and made slaves out of them, and he wanted to kill the males because if he killed all the males, then he would just have the women they could use for the Egyptians, and the male Hebrews would no longer continue to go, and he thought that would weaken them. But God had provided a plan. God had provided a way for them. Near the end of their enslavement, a couple from the tribe of Levi had a son they believed was special. When he was 3 months old, his mother sealed a basket with tar and pitch so it would float, and put it in the river among the reeds near the bank. Pharaoh's daughter found him when she went to bathe in the river, and took him for her own. His sister, who had been watching him from a distance, went to Pharaoh's daughter and asked if she could find someone to nurse the child until he was weaned. She brought his mother to Pharaoh's daughter, who hired her as his nurse. Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses because she took him from the water. He was raised as Pharaoh's grandson, but in his heart he knew he was an Israelite. When Moses was grown up, he visited the Hebrew slaves and saw how they were burdened down with hard labor. When he saw a taskmaster beating one of the slaves, he killed him and buried him in the sand. The next day, he saw 2 Hebrew slaves fighting each other, and he tried to break it up. The slave asked him who made him a judge over them, and asked if he was going to kill them like he did the Egyptian. Then Moses fled Egypt because this was known, and Pharaoh would have him executed when he found him. He fled to Midian, where he tended sheep for Jethro, the priest of Midian, and married his daughter. Having tended the sheep for about 40 years, Moses saw a bush on fire, but not being burned up. He approached the bush, and God spoke to him from the bush. He told him to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to free the Israelites. Pharaoh refused to comply with Moses' demands, and God judged Egypt for their treatment of Israel. He sent 10 plagues to Egypt as judgment against them. First, the water was turned to blood. Then frogs invaded the land. Then lice. Then flies. Then a plague that killed the cattle of Egypt but did not touch Israel's cattle. Then the Egyptians and their remaining livestock were stricken with boils, hail which killed both livestock and people who did not take shelter, and destroyed crops. Then the plague of locusts came and ate the remaining crops. Following this, God sent Egypt into such extreme darkness that it could be felt. Pharaoh still hardened his heart and refused to let Israel go. The last of the plagues was the death of the firstborn in Egypt. This passing over of the death angel gives us a clear picture of Christ's substitution. The Passover account is recorded in Exodus chapter 12. In preparation to leave Egypt, Each family was to get the spotless lamb no more than a year old. This lamb was to be roasted with fire, and all of it was to be eaten. If any of it was left by morning, it was to be burned up with fire. This lamb was to be eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The leavening symbolized sin, so the bread was to be unleavened, free from sin. The bitter herbs symbolized the bitterness of bondage. The lamb was the offering for sin as a substitute for the firstborn of each family. The doorposts and lintels were painted with blood from the lamb. When the death angel passed through Egypt, he killed the firstborn of man and beast in all of Egypt. But when he saw the blood on the doorposts and the lintels, he passed over, and no one died in that house. Jesus is our sacrifice lamb, who died in our place to redeem us from the bondage of sin and its effect. His blood is applied to our hearts so we will not die for our sins. Jesus died in our place and for our sins so we can live. Just as the Jews ate one whole lamb for each family, so we receive all of Jesus into our lives and feast upon his word and drink of his spirit. At each Passover, the Jews remember how God delivered them from the bitter bondage in Egypt and brought them out with a mighty hand and astounding miracles. They celebrate this event with the Passover meal. It was at the last Passover meal with the disciples that Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper when he broke the bread and said, "Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you." And with the cup, he said, "Drink ye all of it. This is my blood which is shed for the remission of sins. This do as oft as ye do it in remembrance of me." Jesus is our Passover lamb, the perfect sacrifice for our sins. He was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The punishment to give us peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. His blood was shed to put away our sins once and for all. He took the punishment for all of our sins to reconcile us to God, just as though we had never sinned. Because of this sacrifice of himself, God can live in and through us now. Never before Jesus had laid down his life was this possible for God to live in people. Next time we will look at Christ's substitution, the actual event. Till then, the Lord bless and keep you, cause his face to shine upon you, and be gracious to you.